Today's show will highlight the New England states of Maine and New Hampshire. Acadia National Park is on the east coast of Maine. Each year, thousands of visitors hike the rocky terrain and rugged shoreline. On this visit to Acadia, we explored the Beehive Trail and Cadillac Mountain. Outside the town of Freeport is the Desert of Maine. This once was the location of a working farm before being overrun by wind-driven sand. In New Hampshire, we drove to the Crawford Notch, hiked to the Arethusa Falls, as well as exploring the Silver Cascade. We also traveled to Kinsman Notch in search of the Lost River. Stay tuned for Adventure Bound. Welcome to Adventure Bound. Hello, I'm Tim Bear. The first stop on today's show will be Acadia National Park in Maine. Acadia has the unusual combination of ocean shoreline and mountain scenery. Perhaps the best way to explore Acadia is by foot on the 120 miles of maintained hiking trails. In the northeast U.S. is the state of Maine. On the coast of Maine is a large mound of rock called Mount Desert Island, which is the location of the town of Bar Harbor and Acadia National Park. The rounded islands near Bar Harbor are visible from Acadia. The appearance of the hunchbacked tree-covered islands inspired the island names of Bald Porcupine Island, Long Porcupine Island, and Burnt Porcupine Island. The parking lot at Acadia's Sand Beach has a view of the rocky rise called the Beehive. Our first excursion of the day was a hike on the Beehive Trail. The 1.5-mile trail that scales the Beehive rises 520 feet above the parking lot at Sand Beach. From the parking lot, we could see hikers on the Beehive Trail that winds up the south side of the granite mound. There are 120 maintained hiking trails in the park. The trails are strictly for hiking use. Mountain bikes are not allowed on any of the hiking trails.
Whoa.
The Beehive Trail starts in the woods and initially has a slight incline. The trail gradually gets steeper as it changes over from a hike to a climb. Following the trail as it snakes up the rock requires walking across ledges next to perpendicular walls of stone. A couple of steep inclines on the trail have iron rungs mounted in the rock to assist in climbing. Other steep sections of the trail do not have iron rungs. However, the rock steps and ledges are large enough so that special climbing gear is not needed for the ascent. The stone ledges of the Beehive Trail provide an elevated view of the sand beach. On this day in July, the weather was quite pleasant, and the blue skies allowed for a clear view of the ocean horizon. This is the last set of iron rungs to be scaled on the ascent to the top of the Beehive. There were very few people on the trail during our hike. It seemed like the mountain was our own private playground. The rough texture of the rock provides excellent traction. Though the climbing is not exceedingly difficult, care must be taken while selecting handholds and foot placement to avoid a fall. It took us about 40 minutes to hike from the parking lot at Sand Beach to the summit of the Beehive. The summits of the 15 or so peaks in Acadia are mostly bare, allowing for a panoramic view of the coastline of Maine and the Atlantic Ocean. If you pack some food, the summit of the Beehive is a great place to break for lunch. After returning from the Beehive, we walked along the shore just south of Sand Beach. Nowhere on the Atlantic seaboard is the rock-bound coast more picturesque than in Acadia. At the shoreline, the ocean waves pound relentlessly at the base of great rock cliffs. In this location, the wind and wave erosion has created a gravel-covered cove with stone pillars. After our hike along the shoreline, we went walking around on the top of Cadillac Mountain. From the shore of Mount Desert Island, the stone landscape climbs to the height of 1,530 feet at the peak of Cadillac Mountain. Mount Desert Island in Acadia is the largest rock-based island on the Atlantic coast of the United States. Cadillac Mountain is the highest point on the U.S. Atlantic seaboard. If you are at the summit bright and early, you could be the first person that day to see the sunrise in the United States. The treeless top of Cadillac Mountain allows for an unobstructed view of the surrounding coast. Samuel de Champlain sighted Mount Desert Island in 1604 and described it as an island of barren mountains. The French were the first European settlers in the area in the year 1613. The name of the park originated with the settlers that were living on Mount Desert Island in the French province of Acadia. The president of Harvard University, Charles W. Eliot, was a summer resident of Mount Desert Island. Charles Eliot proposed the creation of an organization to protect public access to designated areas of Maine. In September of 1901, Eliot formed the Hancock County Trustees of Public Reservations with the purpose of acquiring and holding lands to allow public access. For the next 15 years, the lands that were acquired by this private organization steadily increased until they totaled 5,000 acres. In 1916, the Hancock County Trustees of Public Reservations donated the land it had acquired to the American people, and President Woodrow Wilson created a national monument. In 1919, Congress designated Acadia as a national park. Acadia was the first national park east of the Mississippi River. While driving down the coast of Maine, we stopped to wander around on sand dunes. We visited an island of sand surrounded by lush green forest. The unusual area is called the Desert of Maine.
A curious attraction in Maine is the sand anomaly called the Desert of Maine. Located on the eastern edge of Maine, the Desert of Maine is 2.5 miles outside the town of Freeport. Today the area looks like a large sandbox, but in the early 1800s this was a working farm with crops and pasture land. Geologists have established that glaciers covered the area 11,000 years ago. At the end of the last ice age, as the glaciers melted, They left behind sand and mineral deposits. Streams carried the sand down to a lake bottom as the ice retreated. Later, these deposits were covered with a layer of topsoil. In 1797, William Tuttle cleared 300 acres of land and established a farm. For several years, the Tuttles were successful in raising crops of potatoes and hay. Despite the effort of the Tuttle family, making the farm viable became increasingly difficult. Several contributing factors led to the downfall of the farm and the creation of the Desert of Maine. Massive land clearing combined with lack of proper crop rotation and overgrazing resulted in the severe soil erosion that exposed the underlying sand. Once started, the spreading of the sand continued, making farming impossible, forcing the Tuttles to abandon the farm. The Tuttles barn has survived through the years. The barn is over 217 years old and is the only building remaining from the Tuttle farm. This tree has been buried by 15 feet of wind-blown sand. As blowing sand covers the tree, the branches gradually transform themselves and become roots, allowing the tree to survive. Driven by the wind, the emerging sand claimed more land. Over time, dunes more than 70 feet high have engulfed entire trees and buildings. This picture of the spring house was taken in the 1950s. Built in 1938, the spring house became completely covered in sand by 1962. Underneath this pole is 8 feet of sand. Underneath the sand is the roof of the spring house. While in the Desert of Maine, you can walk around the sand dunes on your own or take a guided safari tour. These narrated coach tours leave every half hour. In 1917, Henry Goldrup bought the land and began to exploit its unique characteristics as a tourist attraction. It has thrived for many decades. The present owners, the Dobson family, bought the desert in 1982 and continue the tradition. The desert contains hundreds of shades of sand, which exist in many colored veins in the desert floor. The colored sand is excavated and used to create sand art. Simply wiping away the top layer of sand exposes the underlying colored veins.
On Route 302 in New Hampshire is the Crawford Notch State Park. On our trip to the Crawford Notch, we stopped to hike to the Arethusa Falls.
The Crawford Notch State Park is in northeast New Hampshire. Route 302 runs through the valley of the Crawford Notch, providing access to many hiking trails. One of the hiking trails in the Notch leads to Arethusa Falls. The trail to Arethusa Falls is well marked and well traveled. The distance from the parking lot to the falls is 1.5 miles, and it takes about an hour to hike to the falls. The trail has a constant rise in elevation as it winds through the rugged terrain. Next to the Arethusa Falls Trail is Bemis Brook. Several places along the trail offer views of water cascading over the granite stream bed. Bemis Brook is a tributary to the Saco River that runs along the floor of the Crawford Notch. Sturdy hiking boots are recommended for this trail. The rugged terrain consists of rocks and boulders of all sizes. The non-uniform rocks and uneven ground require that hikers pay attention to their footfalls to avoid falling or twisting an ankle. Trees along the path cling desperately to the hillside. Erosion from the foot traffic, ice, and water has washed away the thin layer of topsoil, exposing the tree roots. The granite rock face of Arethusa Falls is 200 feet tall, making it the highest waterfall in New Hampshire. small squirrel was scampering around the rocks at the base of the falls. As Tim watched the squirrel, it zeroed in on an unattended plastic bottle. This bold little fellow was unafraid to do battle with a 6-foot invader holding a video camera.
Yippee! I found it! The most magnificent object in the world! I will take it home and treasure it forever.
Dude, what are you doing with that?
Go away. I saw it first.
Tim picked up the bottle and an epic struggle ensued.
It's my bottle. Let go.
Why do you want the bottle?
I saw it first.
It's my bottle.
No,
I want it.
it's mine.
Let go.
No way.
Let go.
Nope. Time out. Okay, time in. Fine, you keep it. I didn't really want it anyway.
After a brief scuffle, Tim was able to lay claim to the plastic trophy. The top of the bottle bears the scars from the tug of war. As we drove to the north end of Crawford Notch, we arrived at the Silver Cascade. The water from the Silver Cascade flows right under Route 302 to join the Saco River. On its 1,000-foot course down Webster Mountain, the water winds its way over the rocks, bounding down from ledge to ledge. The Saco River and Route 302 run along the floor of the Crawford Notch between the Webster and Willie Mountains. The Crawford Notch was created when the Pleistocene ice sheet pushed through the narrow pass. While on a hunting expedition in 1771, Timothy Nash discovered the Crawford Notch. The governor had promised a land grant to Nash if he could bring a horse through the notch. Nash and a companion successfully hauled the animal up and down the steep and rocky terrain using ropes. In 1826, a landslide thundered down Willie Mountain, killing the fleeing family for which the mountain is named. Though the family was killed, the Willie family home was spared by the slide. Promptly repaired after the 1826 landslide, the road through Crawford Notch became instrumental in the opening of New Hampshire's North Country. The turnpike served as a channel of commerce until the railroad crossed the Notch in 1875. As we continued on Route 302, we came upon what we initially thought was a traffic jam. We got out to investigate and discovered that the source of the holdup was a moose. Unruffled by the swarming paparazzi, Mr. Moose continued eating his dinner.
Guess this would
Doesn't
be
seem
it.
the least bit startled by like 100 people stopping to look at it.
It's photo op. And here's my best side.
I know.
Strike a pose. Good, thank you.
The following day, we drove through the Franconia Notch and stopped to gaze at the old man on the mountain. The Great Stone Face profile is not man-made. It's a natural rock formation which was known to the Native Americans for many years. White men first saw it in 1805. Suspended 1,200 feet above Profile Lake, the profile is 40 feet tall and about 25 feet wide. The stone profile is featured on the reverse side of the 2000 New Hampshire quarter.
In the Kinsman Notch in New Hampshire is a boulder-filled ravine. The rock formations and boulder-created caves hide the running water of the Lost River. Not far from the Crawford Notch in the White Mountains of New Hampshire is the Kinsman Notch and Lost River. The journey to Lost River begins with a walk along the entrance trail on a boardwalk. On the walk, you will descend about 300 vertical feet to the base of the gorge. Our first stop was at the Gorge View platform for a preview of what was to come. Lost River is so named because the brook draining the southern part of the Kinsman Notch disappears below the surface of the narrow, steep-walled glacial gorge. The gorge is partially filled with immense blocks of granite. Lost River winds through a series of glacial-formed boulder caves and potholes. The largest is 25 feet in diameter and 60 feet deep. Wooden walkways, bridges, and ladders play an important part in making the gorge accessible. A masterpiece of native New Hampshire craftsmanship, the network is designed to stay in place year-round. Not only is the pathway strong enough to carry thousands of people each season, it withstands the ravages of winter snows and the torrent of water from spring snowmelt or rainstorms. The whole boardwalk network is designed to be sturdy enough to be submerged in high water on occasions, and open enough so that it will not act as a dam and catch debris. A very interesting animal dwells in the Kinsman Notch, the red eft. It begins life as a red-spotted newt, a water dweller. In the autumn, though, the newt crawls out of the water, turns red, and loses its gills. Now it is an air-breathing eft. After several years of living in the air, the eft turns green and re-enters the water, returning to water-breathing life as a newt. The river flows out of sight and gets lost as it runs into the empty spaces around and under the granite blocks. Eventually, the water re-emerges and joins the Pemigewasset River, which flows southward from Franconia Notch. The self-guided tour around Lost River is about 3/4 of a mile in length and takes around an hour. You can easily walk into some caves, but others require some agility to negotiate. You can, of course, stay on the boardwalk and bypass all the caves. I noticed that children derived great amusement from traversing the narrow tunnels and passageways. I made the same observation about their parents. The water of Paradise Falls plummets 35 feet, making it one of the most spectacular sights in the gorge. The waterfall was formed by the river flowing over two parallel pegmatite dikes, which are more resistant to abrasive wear than the rest of the granite in the area. The basin at the floor of the falls is an irregular-shaped pothole, which was scoured out of granite thousands of years ago. The first documented exploration of Lost River took place in 1852 when a fisherman fell into one of the caves. The Jackman brothers, Royal and Lyman, were fishing along a stream in the area, climbing over and around the boulders. Suddenly, Lyman disappeared from sight, seemingly swallowed by the earth. Without warning, he had slipped through a moss-covered hole and dropped into a cave about 15 feet below, landing up to his waist in a pool of water. The cave is known today as Shadow Cave. In the years that followed the 1852 discovery, the Jackman brothers continued to explore the area, finding more caves and spreading the story of hidden wonders of Kinsman Notch throughout the region. As with other notches, Kinsman was widened and deepened by the Pleistocene ice sheet. As the ice sheet retreated, the sides of the gorge were exposed to the harsh climate. Water seeped into the cracks in the rock and then froze in the winter. As the water froze, it expanded, breaking off huge blocks of granite that plunged into the Lost River Gorge, forming the narrow passages and caves. The sound of splashing water is ever present, except in the Cave of Silence. Named the Cave of Silence because it is the only spot on this tour where the sound of rushing water can't be heard. The caves and rock formations have been given names, some deriving from Norse mythology, others from imagination. The names include Fenris the Wolf, the Sun Altar, the Hall of Ships, and Thor's Workshop. The caves are not very long or exceptionally deep. Some of the caves have artificial lighting. In any case, no matter which cave you explore, daylight is never far away. For steep inclines, ladders have been constructed to allow easier access to the granite rooms. Some caves have wood walkways and platforms. Other caves have steps and railings so that it is easy to get into and out of the caves. The cave with the narrowest passage is called the Lemon Squeezer. Outside the cave entrance, there is a squeezer gauge. If you are unable to get through the gauge, you will not be able to get through the narrow cave passage. Thank you for watching Adventure Bound. I'm Tim Bear. Good day.